The moment I saw Carol Hutchins marching up my driveway through the falling snow, clutching a binder to her chest like it was the Holy Grail itself, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to get ruined. I had just finished clearing my driveway with my brand new snowblower, a beautiful red Ariens Deluxe 28 that I'd saved up 3 months to buy, and I was standing in my garage admiring how clean everything looked when she appeared like some kind of winter storm warning come to life. "Walter. Walter Vaughn," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet morning air like a buzzsaw. "We need to talk." I considered pretending I hadn't heard her and just closing the garage door, but Carol Hutchins wasn't the type of woman who took a hint. As the vice president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, she took her position with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for Supreme Court justices or brain surgeons. She was in her early 50s, with that specific haircut that seemed to be standard issue for HOA board members, short and angular. And she always dressed like she was about to attend a business meeting even when it was 6 degrees outside and snowing sideways. "Morning, Carol," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" She stopped at the entrance to my garage, eyeing my snowblower with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "I see you've purchased new equipment." "Yeah, just got it last week." "Makes clearing the driveway a lot easier than that old shovel I was using." "How much did that cost?" she asked, which was an incredibly rude question, but Carol had never been big on social niceties. "I don't see how that's relevant," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. She flipped open her binder, which I could now see was labeled Meadowbrook Hills Community Enhancement Initiatives, in neat block letters. "The HOA has been discussing ways to improve our community's winter maintenance efficiency. We've noticed that only about 30% of residents have snow removal equipment, which leads to unsightly driveways and unsafe conditions during heavy snowfall." "Okay," I said slowly, not sure where this was going but already not liking it. "The board has drafted a proposal for a community sharing program. Residents who own snow removal equipment would be required to assist their neighbors who don't have access to such tools. It promotes community spirit and ensures everyone maintains their properties according to HOA standards." I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I realized she was serious. "You want me to share my snowblower? Not just you, of course. Anyone with equipment. But yes, when your neighbors need assistance, you would be expected to help them clear their driveways." "Carol, I just spent $800 on this thing. It's my property. I'm not running a charity snow removal service." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The HOA covenants clearly state that all residents must contribute to the betterment of the community. This falls under that umbrella." "No, it really doesn't. Show me where in the covenants it says I have to lend out my personal property to anyone who asks." She flipped through several pages in her binder, her finger tracing down lines of text. Section 7. Paragraph 12 states that homeowners must maintain their properties to community standards and assist in maintaining community values. That's talking about keeping your lawn mowed and not painting your house neon pink, Carol. It doesn't mean I have to hand over my equipment." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the full board has to say about your interpretation at the next meeting. In the meantime, Deborah Miller across the street mentioned she saw you out here with your new snowblower, and she hasn't been able to clear her driveway yet. I'm sure you'd be willing to be a good neighbor and help her out." I glanced across the street at Deborah's house. Deborah was a perfectly capable woman in her mid-40s who drove a Range Rover and took regular ski trips to Aspen. She could afford her own damn snowblower. "Deborah has a husband and 2 teenage sons. I'm sure they can handle it." Her husband is out of town on business, and the boys are at a basketball tournament. Are you really going to leave a woman to struggle, Carol? She can hire a service. There are about 15 different snow removal companies in Cleveland that would be happy to clear her driveway for $50. But you're right here, and you have the equipment. It would take you 15 minutes. Why are you being so selfish? That word hit me wrong. Selfish. As if buying myself something with my own money and not wanting to run a free service for the entire neighborhood made me some kind of villain. I'm not being selfish. I'm setting reasonable boundaries about my property and my time. Well, Carol snapped her binder shut. I'll be bringing this up at the HOA meeting next Tuesday, 7 p.m. sharp. I strongly suggest you attend. She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her boots leaving angry prints in the thin layer of snow that had already started accumulating again. I watched her go, feeling a headache forming behind my eyes. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Hills 3 years ago after my divorce from Patricia was finalized. The neighborhood had seemed nice enough, a quiet subdivision of modest 2-story homes built in the early 2000s, with mature trees and well-maintained streets. The HOA fees were reasonable at $50 a month, and the rules had seemed standard when I'd reviewed them before buying. Don't leave your trash cans visible from the street. Keep your grass cut. No commercial vehicles parked in driveways overnight. Basic stuff. But about a year after I moved in, there had been an election for new board members, and Carol Hutchins had won the vice president position by running on a platform of strengthening community standards and increasing property values. Since then, life in Meadowbrook Hills had become significantly more complicated. The HOA meetings, which used to be quick monthly affairs dealing with maintenance issues and budget reviews, had turned into marathon sessions where Carol proposed new rules and initiatives. She'd successfully pushed through regulations about approved flower colors for front gardens, restrictions on when holiday decorations could be displayed, and a requirement that all exterior home improvements be reviewed by the architectural committee, which she chaired, even if it was just replacing a doorbell. I went back inside my house, stomping the snow off my boots in the mudroom. My golden retriever, Biscuit, wandered over to greet me, tail wagging hopefully. I scratched behind his ears and tried to let go of my irritation. It was Saturday. I had the whole weekend ahead of me. I wasn't going to let Carol Hutchins ruin it, except I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. The more I replayed it in my mind, the angrier I got, the entitlement of it, the assumption that because I had something, I should be obligated to share it with everyone else. I'd worked hard for my money. I was a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing firm in downtown Cleveland, and while I made a decent living, it wasn't like I was rich. $800 for a snowblower was a significant purchase that I'd budgeted for carefully. By Sunday afternoon, I'd convinced myself that Carol's proposal would never fly at the HOA meeting. It was too absurd. The other board members would shut it down immediately. The president, Frank Rodriguez, was a reasonable guy. He'd been on the board for almost a decade and had always taken a measured approach to things. He'd see how ridiculous this was. I should have known better. Tuesday evening arrived with another fresh dumping of snow. I used my snowblower to clear my driveway again, and yes, I'll admit it felt great. The machine cut through the snow like butter, throwing it in neat arcs onto my lawn. The whole job took maybe 20 minutes, including clearing the sidewalk in front of my house. When I'd been using a shovel, the same task had taken over an hour and left my back aching for days. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a small building at the entrance to our subdivision that mostly sat empty, except for these monthly gatherings and the occasional kid's birthday party rental. I arrived at 5 minutes to 7, shaking snow off my coat as I entered the overheated main room. About 20 other residents were already there, scattered among the rows of folding chairs. That was actually a pretty good turnout. Usually, these meetings drew maybe 10 people. Carol was at the front table with the other board members. Frank Rodriguez, the president, Sandra Chen, the secretary, and Tom Mercer, the treasurer. Carol had papers spread out in front of her and was speaking intently to Frank, who was nodding along with that patient expression he always wore when dealing with her. I took a seat toward the back, next to my neighbor Jerry Walsh, who lived 2 houses down from me. Jerry was in his 60s, retired from the post office, and had the distinction of being the only person on the street who seemed to genuinely enjoy dealing with HOA politics. "Heard Carol's got it out for you," Jerry whispered as I sat down. "Word travels fast," I muttered. "Deborah Miller's been telling everyone who'll listen that you refused to help her clear her driveway. Made it sound like you laughed in her face while she begged. That's not even remotely what happened. Carol showed up uninvited and tried to tell me I was obligated to share my snowblower." Jerry shook his head. "Carol's been pushing this community sharing thing for months. She really believes she's building some kind of utopia here. She needs a hobby. This is her hobby, and she's got nothing but time since her divorce. That was new information. I didn't know she was divorced. Just finalized about 6 months ago. Pretty messy from what I heard. Might explain why she's gone into overdrive with the HOA stuff." Frank called the meeting to order, and we went through the usual preliminaries. Minutes from the last meeting were read and approved. The treasurer's report showed we were slightly under budget for the year, mostly because we'd had a mild autumn and hadn't needed to do as much leaf removal as anticipated. There was a brief discussion about resurfacing the community center parking lot in the spring. Then Carol cleared her throat. "I'd like to propose a new initiative under new business." Here we go, I thought. As we're all aware, we've had significant snowfall already this winter, and forecasts suggest we'll continue to get above average precipitation through March. I've observed that many of our residents struggle with snow removal, leading to unsafe conditions and properties that don't meet our community standards. She pulled out a poster board that she'd apparently prepared, with photos of various driveways in the neighborhood that hadn't been cleared promptly. I recognized a few of the houses. One belonged to the Petersons, an elderly couple in their 80s. Another was the Morrison place, where a single mom lived with her 3 kids. A third was Deborah Miller's house, and I'd bet money that photo had been taken the morning Carol came to my garage. "I propose we implement a community winter assistance program," Carol continued. "Residents who own snow removal equipment would be added to a registry. When snow falls, neighbors who need assistance can contact the registry, and equipment owners would be assigned to help them." "Assigned," I spoke up from the back. "We'd be assigned to clear other people's driveways." Carol's eyes found me in the crowd. Voluntarily assigned, of course, but we would track participation, and those who consistently refused to contribute to the program would be noted in their homeowner files. "For what purpose?" I asked. "It's simply a record of community involvement." Just as we track violations of covenants, Frank shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. "Carol, I'm not sure we can require residents to share personal property. That seems like it might be overstepping our authority." "I'm not suggesting we require anything," Carol said smoothly. "This would be a voluntary program, but I think most of our residents would be happy to participate once they understand the community benefits." "What about liability?" Tom Mercer spoke up. He was an insurance agent, so of course he'd go straight to that angle. "If I'm using my snowblower on someone else's property and they slip and fall, Or if the equipment damages something, who's responsible? The HOA could obtain additional insurance coverage, Carol said, though she sounded less confident now. That would increase our monthly fees, Tom pointed out. Sandra Chen, the secretary, flipped through some papers. I've reviewed our covenants, and I don't see anything that would support making this mandatory, even indirectly through tracking participation. If someone wants to volunteer to help their neighbors, that's wonderful, but I don't think we can create an official program that pressures people to hand over their property. Carol's jaw tightened. This isn't about pressure. It's about community spirit. It's about neighbors helping neighbors. When did we become so individualistic that we can't even help each other out? It's not about individualism, I said, standing up so I could be heard better. It's about property rights. I bought my snowblower with my own money for my own use. If I want to help a neighbor, I'll do it on my own terms, not because the HOA is tracking whether I'm being a good community member. No one's attacking your property rights, Walter, Carol said, and there was an edge to her voice now. But you live in a community with covenants and standards. You agreed to those standards when you bought your house. Show me the standard that says I have to share my tools. It's implied in our community values. That's not how contracts work. Frank raised his hands. Okay, let's all take a breath. Carol, I appreciate the thought you've put into this proposal, but I think we need more time to consider the legal and practical implications. I suggest we table this discussion until next month's meeting and ask our HOA attorney to review the proposal. Carol looked like she wanted to argue, but 3 other board members were nodding in agreement with Frank. Fine, she said curtly, but I hope everyone here considers what kind of community we want to live in. One where we help each other, or one where we just look out for ourselves. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering mundane topics like the contract for lawn care services and a request from the Andersons to install a fence in their backyard. I barely paid attention, still irritated by Carol's implications that I was somehow morally deficient for not wanting to run a free snow removal service. After the meeting ended, several people came up to me. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman whose driveway had been in one of Carol's photos, apologized that her house had been used as an example. I didn't know she was going to do that, she said, looking embarrassed. My son usually comes over to help us, but he was sick last week. You don't need to apologize, I told her. And if you need help, just let me know. I'm happy to clear your driveway when your son can't make it. See, that's what I'm talking about. Carol's voice came from behind me. She'd appeared like a shark smelling blood. You're willing to help Mrs. Peterson, but not Deborah. Mrs. Peterson is 83 years old and can't physically handle a shovel, I said. Deborah is perfectly capable of either clearing her own driveway or hiring someone to do it. So you only help people if you deem them worthy. You get to decide who deserves assistance. I get to decide what I do with my property and my time, yes. That's kind of the definition of ownership. Carol stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. You're going to regret making an enemy of me, Walter. I know every single covenant in that book, and I promise you, I'll find something you're violating. Everyone violates something eventually. Is that a threat? It's a promise. She smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Enjoy your snowblower while you can. She walked away, leaving me standing there with a cold feeling in my gut that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Over the next few days, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. Work kept me busy. The plant was ramping up production for a new contract, and I was spending long hours on the floor troubleshooting equipment issues. By the time I got home each evening, I just wanted to walk Biscuit, eat dinner, and zone out in front of the TV. But Carol wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. The first notice appeared in my mailbox on Friday. It was a formal HOA violation letter, printed on official letterhead, informing me that my trash cans had been visible from the street on Thursday morning past the permitted time of 9 a.m. The fine was $50. I checked the timestamp on my doorbell camera footage. The trash truck had arrived at 8:45 a.m. I'd pulled my cans back into the garage at 9:03. 3 minutes late, I called Frank Rodriguez. "Are you kidding me with this?" Frank sighed heavily. "Walter, I didn't issue that notice. Carol's been given authority to monitor covenant compliance as vice president. She's fining me $50 for being 3 minutes late getting my trash cans in. Technically, the covenant does say they need to be stored out of sight by 9 a.m. "Frank, come on. This is harassment." "I hear you, but my hands are tied unless you want to appeal the fine at next month's meeting. You'd present your evidence, Carol would present hers, and the board would vote. And let me guess, Carol gets a vote. She does. So I'm screwed." "I didn't say that. Bring your doorbell footage showing the timing. Most of the board is reasonable. We don't want to fine people for being 3 minutes late." I ended the call feeling frustrated but slightly hopeful. Then the weekend arrived and things got worse. Saturday morning, I was doing laundry when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Carol standing there with a measuring tape and a clipboard. Behind her was a man I didn't recognize, wearing a polo shirt with Meadowbrook Hills HOA embroidered on it. "What's going on?" I asked. "Routine property inspection," Carol said crisply. "This is Dennis, our new compliance officer. We're conducting spot checks to ensure all properties meet covenant standards. You can't just show up and inspect my property without notice." She held up a piece of paper. "According to Section 14 of the Covenants, the HOA reserves the right to inspect exterior property conditions at any time to ensure compliance with community standards. You don't have to let us inside your home, but we're entitled to inspect anything visible from the property line." I scanned the document she'd thrust at me. Sure enough, buried in the dense legal language, there was a clause about inspections. I'd never paid attention to it before because in 3 years of living here, no one had ever conducted an inspection. Fine. Inspect away. Carol and Dennis spent the next 20 minutes walking around my property, measuring things, taking photos, and making notes. I watched from the doorway, arms crossed, feeling my blood pressure rising with each passing minute. When they finished, Carol approached with her clipboard. "We've identified several violations. Your grass along the side fence is 3.2 inches tall. Maximum permitted height during dormant winter months is 3 inches. Your exterior light fixture on the garage is not on the approved list of styles. And your mailbox post shows weather damage and needs to be repainted. The grass is dormant and covered in snow. Who cares if it's slightly over 3 inches? The covenants care. You'll receive formal violation notices in writing with the associated fines. You'll have 30 days to remediate each issue. This is insane. You're coming after me because I wouldn't share my snowblower." Dennis shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Carol's expression remained impassive. "I'm simply enforcing the covenants that all residents agreed to. If you're in violation, it's your own fault, not mine." After they left, I went inside and poured myself a bourbon even though it wasn't even noon yet. Biscuit nuzzled my leg, sensing my distress. I scratched his ears and tried to think rationally about the situation. Carol was clearly on a vendetta against me. The trash can timing, the impromptu inspection, the nitpicking violations, these weren't coincidences. She was making good on her threat to find something I was violating. And given how dense and absurdly specific the HOA covenants were, she could probably keep finding things indefinitely if she was motivated enough. I spent the rest of the weekend reading through the entire covenant document, all 47 pages of it. It was mind-numbing. There were rules about everything. The exact shade of white your front door could be. The specific types of mulch permitted in flower beds. The approved list of mailbox designs, which had apparently been updated 3 years ago before I'd moved in, and my mailbox was a slightly older style that hadn't been grandfathered in properly. By Sunday night, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to keep fighting this battle. It wasn't worth the stress. Carol wanted my snowblower to be available for community use. Fine. She could have it, or rather, someone else could have it. Monday morning, I listed the snowblower on Facebook Marketplace. I priced it competitively at $500, noting that it was less than a month old and in perfect condition. By Monday evening, I had 6 interested buyers. I sold it Tuesday afternoon to a guy from Parma who was thrilled to get such a good deal. Then I did something that I knew would infuriate Carol even more than refusing to share the snowblower. I hired a professional snow removal service. I found a company called Premier Property Care that serviced the Cleveland suburbs. For $200 a month during the winter season, they'd clear my driveway and sidewalk within 6 hours of any snowfall over 2 inches. They had good reviews, were licensed and insured, and offered a service-level agreement guaranteeing response times. The next HOA meeting was on the first Tuesday of March. By that time, we'd had 3 more significant snowfalls. Each time, Premier Property Care had cleared my driveway perfectly while I was at work. I'd also remediate the violations Carol had cited, cutting the grass along the side fence, replacing my garage light fixture with an approved model, and repainting my mailbox post. I'd challenged the trash confine with my doorbell footage, and the board had voted to waive it, with Carol voting against. I arrived at the meeting curious to see how Carol would react when she realized I'd sold the snowblower. I didn't have to wait long. "Before we begin official business," Carol announced once everyone was seated, "I want to address a concerning situation. It has come to my attention that Walter Vaughn, who previously owned snow removal equipment, has sold that equipment and is now using a commercial service." All eyes turned to me. I kept my expression neutral. "I'm failing to see what the problem is," Frank said, sounding genuinely confused. "The problem," Carol said with barely contained irritation, "is that this is clearly a deliberate move to avoid participating in community assistance. He sold the equipment specifically so he wouldn't have to share it." "Carol," I said, standing up, "you made it clear at the last meeting that the community sharing program wasn't going to be implemented. Since I was under no obligation to share my equipment, I made a financial decision to sell it and hire professionals instead. My driveway is being cleared more reliably than when I was doing it myself, and I'm supporting a local business. I don't see the issue. The issue is your attitude. Your complete lack of community spirit. My lack of community spirit. I remediate every single one of those violations you cited, even though most of them were absurdly petty. I challenged one unfair fine and accepted the rest. I follow the rules. I pay my HOA fees on time, and I keep my property maintained. What more do you want from me? I want residents who care about their neighbors. I do care about my neighbors. I helped Mrs. Peterson last week when her son was out of town. I cleared the Johnson sidewalk when they were both down with the flu. I do help people, Carol. I just don't do it because you tell me to." "That's not the same as systematic community support," Frank interrupted. "Carol, I think we need to drop this. Walter's right. He's not violating any covenants. How he chooses to manage his snow removal is his business." Carol's face flushed red. "Of course you'd take his side. You've been blocking my initiatives from the beginning. I haven't been blocking anything. I've been asking for reasonable consideration of legal and practical issues. The meeting devolved from there. Carol and Frank got into a heated argument about the board's direction and Carol's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. Other residents chimed in with their own complaints. It turned out I wasn't the only one who'd been hit with petty violation notices. The Hendersons had been fined for having a garden gnome that wasn't on the approved decorations list. The Williamses had been cited for parking their car slightly crooked in their driveway. The Chens, no relation to Sandra, had been fined for having a welcome mat in a non-approved color. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been made and passed to review the enforcement process and establish clearer guidelines about what constituted a reasonable violation versus petty harassment. Carol voted against it, naturally, but she was outvoted 4-1. I left that meeting thinking maybe things would calm down now. The board was clearly reining Carol in, and she'd have to back off her vendetta against me. I should have known better. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. But this wasn't from the HOA. It was from the City of Cleveland Heights Building Department, informing me that a complaint had been filed about unpermitted construction on my property. An inspector would be coming by on Friday to investigate unpermitted construction. I hadn't done any construction. I called the number on the notice and got a tired-sounding woman who explained that someone had reported I'd built a shed or other structure in my backyard without the required permits. I don't have a shed, I told her. I haven't built anything. Well, someone reported it, so we have to send an inspector. It's probably nothing, but we're required to follow up on all complaints. The inspector came Friday afternoon. I'd taken a half-day off work to be there. He was a middle-aged guy named Pete who seemed as annoyed about the situation as I was. He walked around my backyard, took some photos, and confirmed that there was, in fact, no unpermitted structure. "You know who filed the complaint?" I asked. It was anonymous, but someone gave a pretty detailed description. They claimed you'd built a large storage shed against the back fence. The only thing back there is my garbage can enclosure, and that was built by the previous owner like 10 years ago. Pete shrugged. Like I said, it's nothing. I'll file a report saying no violation was found. Sorry you got hassled for no reason. After he left, I stood in my backyard staring at the garbage can enclosure, and a cold certainty settled in my gut. Carol had filed that complaint. It was too much of a coincidence, and the timing was too perfect. She'd ramped up her harassment to a new level, involving city officials in her personal vendetta. That weekend, I did something I'd been avoiding. I called a lawyer. His name was Mitchell Warner, and he specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Cleveland, in a historic building with creaky floors and walls lined with law books. I met with him on Monday morning before work and laid out everything that had happened. The snowblower demand, the violation notices, the property inspection, the bogus building complaint. Mitchell listened carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "What you're describing is harassment, but proving it's going to be tricky. The HOA does have the right to enforce its covenants, even if we think some of those enforcements are petty. The building complaint is more concerning because, if she's filing false reports with city officials, that could be a legal issue. So what are my options? You could sue the HOA for selective enforcement and harassment. But that's expensive and time-consuming, and HOA cases can drag on for years. A better first step might be to file a formal complaint with the HOA board documenting the pattern of harassment and requesting they remove Carol from any compliance enforcement role. She's the vice president. Will they actually do that? If enough residents complain, they might. The board has liability here too. If Carol's actions are creating legal exposure for the HOA, they need to rein her in. I left Mitchell's office with a plan. He'd draft a formal complaint letter for me to submit to the board. In the meantime, I document everything Carol did. Photos, timestamps, copies of all notices. If this ended up in court, I'd have a paper trail, but I also decided to do something else. I started talking to my neighbors. It turned out almost everyone had a Carol story. She'd reported the Mitchells for having a basketball hoop at the end of their driveway, even though it was portable, and they only put it up when their kids were playing. She'd complained about the Davises' dog barking, leading to multiple visits from animal control, even though their dog was elderly and barely made noise. She tried to force the Binghams to remove a perfectly legal and attractive landscaping rock arrangement because it wasn't explicitly listed on the approved materials list. The more people I talked to, the clearer it became that Carol had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months, and everyone was afraid to push back because they didn't want to become her next target. But now that I'd already become the target and was fighting back, others were willing to speak up. We organized a petition. 23 households signed it, over half the neighborhood, requesting that the HOA board remove Carol Hutchins from all enforcement duties and implement oversight procedures to prevent selective or retaliatory enforcement actions. We submitted it 2 weeks before the April meeting. I also did something else. I filed my own complaint with the city about Carol making a false report. I had to go down to the building department in person and fill out paperwork explaining that I believed someone had filed a knowingly false complaint against me. They said they'd investigate, but I wasn't holding my breath. False complaint cases were apparently hard to prove unless you had solid evidence of who filed it and could demonstrate they knew it was false. The April HOA meeting was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread that there was going to be a reckoning. Frank called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the petition. The board has received and reviewed the complaints submitted by multiple residents regarding enforcement procedures. This is obviously a serious matter, and we take it very seriously. Carol sat rigid in her chair, her face pale. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. After consulting with our HOA attorney, Frank continued, the board has voted to implement several changes. First, all violation notices must be reviewed and approved by at least 2 board members before being issued. Second, we're establishing an appeals process that doesn't require waiting for the monthly meeting. Third, and most significantly, Carol Hutchins has resigned from her position as vice president, effective immediately. A murmur ran through the crowd. Carol stood abruptly. I did not resign. Frank pulled out a piece of paper. We have your resignation letter here, Carol, submitted this afternoon. That was conditional. I said I'd resign if certain conditions weren't met regarding board support for my initiatives. That's not how resignations work. You submitted it in writing and we've accepted it. We appreciate your service to the community, but it's time for new leadership. Carol's hands were shaking. You can't do this. I've dedicated 2 years to this board. I've worked harder than any of you to improve this community. I've enforced standards that the rest of you were too lazy or too weak to enforce. And this is how you repay me. Sandra Chen spoke up softly. Carol, you've done good work in many areas, but the enforcement approach has become problematic. We've received too many complaints. We have to listen to what the community is telling us. The community is full of selfish people who don't care about property values or standards, Carol shot back, her voice rising. They just want to do whatever they want without any accountability. Well, fine. See how long it takes for this neighborhood to turn into a dump without someone willing to hold people responsible. She grabbed her binder and her purse and stormed toward the exit. As she passed my row, she stopped and turned to glare at me. This is your fault. You couldn't just be a good neighbor. You had to make everything difficult. You destroyed this community. You destroyed your own position by harassing people, Carol. I just defended myself. For a moment, I thought she might actually take a swing at me. Her whole body was trembling with rage. But then she spun away and marched out of the community center, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. The meeting continued with much lighter atmosphere after that. We elected Jerry Walsh as the new vice president. Several of the petty fines that had been issued over the past few months were reviewed and waived. Frank apologized on behalf of the board for letting things get so out of hand. I thought that was the end of it. Carol was off the board, her power was gone, and life could return to normal in Meadowbrook Hills. I even felt a little bad for her. She'd clearly been going through something, and the HOA had become an unhealthy outlet for whatever anger or pain she was feeling about her divorce. But 2 weeks later, things took a turn I never saw coming. I was at work when I got a call from Jerry Walsh. "Walter, you need to come home right now." "What's wrong?" "Just come home. Trust me." I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and drove back to Meadowbrook Hills with my heart pounding. When I turned onto my street, I saw 3 police cars parked in front of Carol's house. Officers were leading her out in handcuffs. I parked in my driveway and walked over to where Jerry was standing with a cluster of neighbors. "What happened?" "They arrested her," Jerry said, his eyes wide, "for vandalism and making false police reports." "What?" Mrs. Peterson, who was wrapped in a thick cardigan despite the mild April weather, leaned in. "Apparently she's the one who's been causing all sorts of trouble, not just with the HOA stuff. Real trouble." Over the next few hours, the story came out. After Carol had resigned from the board, she'd apparently spiraled. She'd been caught on a doorbell camera spray painting obscenities on the Mitchell's garage door. When the police had investigated, they'd searched her home and found evidence that she'd made multiple false reports over the past months. Not just the building complaint against me, but reports to animal control about non-existent dangerous dogs, complaints to the health department about imaginary code violations, even a couple of calls to CPS about neighborhood kids that had been completely fabricated. One of the officers who'd been at the scene was still parked on the street doing paperwork. I walked over and politely asked if he could tell me anything about what had happened. "Are you one of the residents she filed reports about?" he asked. "I believe so, yes." He consulted his notes. "Walter Vaughn, that's me." "Yeah, you're on the list." She had files on about a dozen people in this neighborhood. Really detailed stuff, notes about your schedules, photos, lists of things she thought you were doing wrong. It's pretty disturbing, honestly. Looks like she became obsessed. A chill ran down my spine. "Files. The detective will probably want to talk to you. Leave your contact info with me." I gave him my number, then walked back to my house feeling shaken. Carol hadn't just been harassing me about the HOA stuff. She'd been actively trying to cause problems for me and others through false official complaints. That was a whole different level of vindictive. The detective, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, called me the next day. She asked me to come down to the station to give a statement. I brought all my documentation. The HOA violation notices, the building department complaint, the timeline I'd been keeping of Carol's actions. Detective Mitchell reviewed everything carefully. Did Miss Hutchins ever threaten you directly? She told me I'd regret making an enemy of her. That she'd find violations in how I was maintaining my property. Did you take that as a threat? At the time, I thought she was just being petty about HOA stuff. I didn't think she'd start filing false reports with city officials. We're building a case for stalking and harassment in addition to the vandalism and false report charges. With your statement and the others we've collected, I think we have a strong case. The prosecutor will be in touch if they need anything else from you. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged. Carol had been documenting residents she felt had wronged her or weren't following HOA rules to her satisfaction. She'd filed at least 15 false reports with various city departments. The spray painting incident with the Mitchells had been the final straw, when their doorbell camera caught her in the act at 2 in the morning. The prosecutor charged her with vandalism, making false reports to law enforcement, and harassment. Because there were multiple victims and evidence of ongoing stalking behavior, the charges were more serious than they might have been for a single incident. I had to testify at her preliminary hearing in May. It was uncomfortable, sitting in that courtroom while Carol glared at me from the defense table. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated community volunteer who'd just been overly zealous in trying to maintain neighborhood standards. The prosecutor countered with evidence of her escalating behavior, the false reports, the vandalism, and the disturbing files she'd kept on residents. The judge found probable cause to proceed to trial and set her bail at $10,000. She posted it and was released with conditions that she stay away from Meadowbrook Hills and all the residents she'd been harassing. The trial was scheduled for August, but in July, Carol took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of vandalism and 3 counts of filing a false report. The other charges were dropped. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail with 4 months suspended, meaning she'd serve 60 days, followed by 2 years of probation. She also had to pay restitution to the Mitchells for the damage to their garage and fines for the false reports. Part of her probation terms required her to have no contact with any Meadowbrook Hills residents and to attend counseling. It was a strange feeling when it was all over. I didn't feel victorious exactly. Mostly, I just felt sad that things had gotten so out of control. Carol had clearly been struggling with something, and instead of getting help, she channeled all her anger and pain into an obsession with controlling her environment through the HOA. Life in Meadowbrook Hills gradually returned to normal. Jerry Walsh turned out to be an excellent vice president, focused on practical community improvements rather than enforcement minutiae. The board revised the covenants to remove some of the most absurdly specific rules and added clearer language about enforcement procedures and resident rights. I kept my contract with Premier Property Care through the following winter. It was honestly one of the best decisions I'd made. Coming home to a clear driveway after a snowstorm without having to spend an hour working the snowblower in freezing temperatures was worth every penny. And I still helped out neighbors who needed it, like Mrs. Peterson and a few others who genuinely needed assistance. But I did it on my own terms, because I wanted to help, not because anyone was demanding it or tracking my participation. The following spring, I ran into Deborah Miller at the grocery store. We'd never really talked much before the whole snowblower incident. "Hey, Walter," she said, looking a bit embarrassed. "I wanted to apologize about the whole thing with Carol and your snowblower. I never asked her to get you to clear my driveway. She just saw I hadn't cleared it yet and decided to make it into this big thing." "It's okay," I said. "I know that wasn't on you." I felt terrible when I found out about everything she'd been doing, the false reports and all that. I had no idea she'd gone that far. None of us did until it all came out. For what it's worth, I hired a snow removal service too. It's so much easier than trying to do it ourselves. I smiled. It really is. We chatted for a few more minutes about neighborhood stuff, then went our separate ways. It was a small moment, but it felt like a closing of the circle somehow. The whole situation had brought the neighborhood together in a weird way. We'd all been living in our separate bubbles, trying to avoid attracting attention or causing problems, and Carol's reign of terror had forced us to actually communicate with each other and stand up collectively for reasonable treatment. The HOA meetings were actually pleasant now. We dealt with real issues like planning the annual neighborhood cleanup day, budgeting for street repairs, and organizing a summer block party. The meetings were shorter, friendlier, and actually productive. I eventually bought another snowblower, a smaller model that was easier to store and maneuver. But I kept Premier Property Care as my primary service. Sometimes, I used the snowblower for quick touch-ups or helping neighbors. Other times, I just kept it as backup in case the service couldn't get to me right away in a big storm. Biscuit continued to be the best part of coming home every day. He didn't care about HOA drama or neighborhood politics. He just wanted his walks, his dinner, and some quality couch time in the evenings. Dogs have the right priorities. A year after Carol's conviction, I heard through Jerry that she'd moved out of state after completing her jail time and probation. She'd sold her house and apparently gone to live with family in Arizona. I hoped she was getting the help she needed and finding a healthier way to deal with whatever had been driving her destructive behavior. As for me, I learned some valuable lessons from the whole experience. First, read every single word of your HOA covenants before you buy a house, and make sure you can live with even the most absurd rules because someone might actually try to enforce them. Second, document everything if you're in a dispute. My meticulous record-keeping had been crucial when things escalated to legal action. Third, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, but also don't let a fight consume your life. There had been times during the worst of it when dealing with Carol had taken up way too much of my mental energy. Most importantly, I learned that community doesn't come from enforcement and rules. It comes from people genuinely caring about each other and choosing to help when they can, not because they're obligated or tracked or threatened with fines, but because it's the right thing to do. These days, when it snows, I watch the Premier Property Care truck make its rounds through the neighborhood. They clear my driveway, and I pay them promptly for their excellent service. And if I see Mrs. Peterson out struggling with her shovel because her son couldn't make it, I grab my snowblower and help her out. Not because the HOA says I should, but because she's my neighbor and she needs help. That's what community should be. People making their own choices about how to contribute and help each other, not being coerced into sharing resources or threatened with punishment for not participating in someone's vision of utopia. I still live in Meadowbrook Hills, and I'm actually pretty happy here now. The neighborhood has good bones. Nice people, decent houses, mature trees, safe streets. The HOA, with its revised approach, actually serves a useful purpose in maintaining common areas and organizing community events without being an oppressive force in everyone's daily lives. Every so often, when I'm clearing my sidewalk with my little backup snowblower or watching the pros handle my driveway, I think about that morning when Carol showed up demanding I share my property. It seems like such a small thing, that snowblower, that set off such a chain of escalating events. But it wasn't really about the snowblower at all. It was about control, boundaries, and what we owe each other as neighbors and community members. I don't regret selling that first snowblower and hiring the service. It was the right call, both practically and symbolically. It removed the thing Carol was fixated on while still ensuring my property was properly maintained. And it led to Carol's behavior escalating to the point where she got caught doing things that were actually illegal, which probably prevented her from victimizing even more people down the line. Sometimes standing your ground on a principle, even over something as mundane as a snowblower, matters more than you realize at the time. Not because the principle itself is earth-shattering, but because it establishes that you won't be bullied or manipulated into surrendering your rights just to avoid conflict. The irony is that I probably would have helped Deborah clear her driveway that first time if Carol had asked nicely instead of demanding it, as if I owed it to her. I've always been willing to help my neighbors. But the moment someone tells me I'm obligated to hand over my property or my time, that they're going to track whether I'm being cooperative enough, that resistance kicks in. And I don't think that makes me selfish or lacking in community spirit. I think it makes me someone who understands the difference between voluntary kindness and coerced compliance. The neighborhood has a new normal now, one that feels healthier and more authentic than whatever Carol was trying to create with her enforcement regime. People help each other because they want to, not because they're afraid of fines or violations or ending up on some list. The HOA serves its legitimate purpose without overreaching into people's personal property decisions. And life goes on, with the regular rhythms of seasons and snow and neighbors waving to each other as they head to work in the morning. Last winter, we had a massive blizzard that dumped almost 2 feet of snow overnight. Premier Property Care was overwhelmed trying to service all their clients. My driveway didn't get cleared until late afternoon. But you know what? Several neighbors came by to check if I needed help. The Morrison kids, those same kids whose single mom Carol had photographed for her shame board, brought over their shovels and helped clear my walkway without being asked. I thanked them, gave them $20 for hot chocolate, and later that week I helped their mom figure out a weird noise her car was making. That's what community looks like. Not forced sharing programs and compliance tracking and threatening people who won't fall in line. Just people being decent to each other because that's what neighbors do. I've been thinking about running for the HOA board myself next election cycle. Not because I want power or control, but because I've learned how important it is to have reasonable people in those positions. People who understand that the goal is to maintain a pleasant neighborhood, not to micromanage everyone's lives or use covenant enforcement as a weapon. Jerry keeps encouraging me to do it. "You've got experience now," he says with a grin. "You've seen the worst of what can happen with an HOA, so you'll know how to keep it from going off the rails." Maybe he's right. We'll see when the time comes. For now, I'm content with my quiet life in Meadowbrook Hills. My job at the plant, my dog Biscuit. My house that I maintain to reasonable standards without obsessing over every blade of grass or minor paint imperfection. My snow removal service that handles the heavy lifting during winter. My willingness to help neighbors who genuinely need it, on my terms, in my way. It's a good life, and I earned my right to live it on my own terms by standing up to someone who tried to tell me that my property wasn't really mine, that my time wasn't really mine, that I owed the community whatever she decided I owed it. I'm glad I fought back, glad I documented everything, and glad that the system ultimately worked the way it was supposed to, holding someone accountable for crossing the line from petty harassment into actual criminal behavior. The Snowblower saga, as I've come to think of it, taught me that sometimes the smallest disputes reveal the biggest truths about power, community, and human nature. And sometimes the best response to an impossible demand isn't to argue or compromise, but to simply remove yourself from the equation entirely. Carol wanted access to my snowblower. I sold it. Problem solved, at least that particular problem. The larger problems with her behavior came to light through her own escalating actions, and justice was eventually served. These days, when I see my neighbors, we actually talk to each other. We know each other's names, ask about each other's families, notice when someone needs help. We built real community connections through the shared experience of dealing with Carol's overreach and banding together to push back against it. In a strange way, her aggressive enforcement actually created the opposite of what she intended. Instead of cowing everyone into compliance, it united us in resistance, and then in rebuilding something better. So yeah, I sold my snowblower and hired a professional service, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Not just because it solved the immediate problem, but because it set in motion a chain of events that ultimately made Meadowbrook Hills a better place to live. Sometimes, you don't realize you're making history when you're just trying to get through your day and maintain your boundaries. But looking back, that moment when Carol showed up in my garage demanding I share my property was the beginning of real change in this neighborhood. Change that was desperately needed, even if none of us fully understood it at the time. And that's the story of how an HOA Karen's demand that I share my snowblower led to criminal charges, neighborhood reform, and a much better community for everyone involved. Well, everyone except Carol, but she made her choices and faced the consequences. The rest of us learned, grew, and built something worth being part of. That's all you can really ask for from a neighborhood, and it's a hell of a lot more than I thought I'd get when I first moved to Meadowbrook Hills all those years ago. Life moves on, snow falls and gets cleared, seasons change and communities evolve. But the lessons stick with you forever.